We recently released jsPsych version 7, and if you are familiar with version 5 or 6, then version 7 might end up feeling kind of like a big change. We ended up breaking a lot of things on purpose. So before I talk about the new stuff that's in version 7, I want to talk a little just about the motivation for why we thought these changes were necessary to make, even with the small amount of sort of refamiliarization that it might take to get used to it. So I wrote the first version of jsPsych. I checked the GitHub logs. It's been almost exactly 10 years. So this is the very first commit to GitHub from 2012. And honestly, I had no idea what I was doing as a JavaScript developer at the time. Like, I could make stuff work, but this is not code that you want to be the sort of the backbone of a piece of software that's getting as widely used as jsPsych. And, I made a lot of improvements since 2012, and version 6 is certainly a lot better than what you're seeing on the screen here. But, a lot has changed with web development since 2012. And even though version 6 was a lot better, a lot of the decisions that I had made in these really early days of the project were still sort of anchoring the direction of the project and how we could maintain the code base. For example, some of these decisions were starting to impact the usability of jsPsych in certain situations. So there were, a subset of developers who wanted to use jsPsych, but use it with sort of these modern JavaScript modules, which is the trend in JavaScript development now, that this is how most JavaScript packages are written. This didn't honestly impact most users because modules aren't really necessary for setting up a JSPsych experiment, and it wasn't how we recommended people to do it. But we got a lot of requests. So we got this request and another request and another and another. And some of these spawned a lot of discussion. So you can see, on this one, there are 34 comments in 2019, 2020 area of people talking about how we could sort of bring jsPsych into the modern age of JavaScript. A few people even generously, tried to contribute to the code and make changes that would support making jsPsych a module. Some of these, involved quite a bit of work, but ultimately all of them were kind of patches, and that was no fault of the contributors. I mean, that was really all that was available to them, was to make patches, because anything else would have required a really drastic overhaul of the code base. At the same time, so this is a a scroll through the main jsPsych file from version 6. It's just over 3,000 lines of code, and as it pauses in certain spots, you can see that most of the code is just uncommented and undocumented. So I understood this code because I had worked with it for so much of the time, but it was really hard for other people to come into the project and make the kinds of changes that were necessary. So the developer experience was kind of lacking. It was a good project for people who were using it, and there were parts of it that were easy to contribute to, but it was really hard to come in and make sustained contributions. And I think Becky was the first person who had to suffer through figuring out this code base, and she made some amazing contributions to the library. So my goal for the past couple of years has really been to transition jsPsych away from something that's sort of my project to something that's more of a community-managed resource, and something where there are multiple people making decisions about the direction of the project, and there are multiple people who have responsibility for any changes to the code base. And I think that will result in a better sort of long-term health for the project. And frankly, this is not what you want. This 3,000 lines of uncommented code is not a sustainable way to build this kind of project. So version 7 was our attempt to fix all of these issues at once. It's a huge change to the code base, but actually it doesn't really add a whole lot of new features. It was a big overhaul for the long-term health of the project, and unfortunately some of the changes that we had to make to sort of meet these long-term health goals broke some of the familiar parts of JSPsych for the users. So I think my goal today is to show you that version 7 is not as radical as it seems. So it's actually not that big of a change for the typical user of JSPsych. Then shortly after we released version 7, we also released version 7.1. And this did add a lot of new features. So I will talk about those after I review the changes that version 7 got us. Okay, so here is my short guide to JSPsych 7 changes if you're already familiar with JSPsych. And if you're not familiar with JSPsych and you're listening to this, I hope that this is still a sort of a useful overview of what the project looks like. And I think the stuff at the end where I talk about some of the new features may be still relevant. Okay, so the first change starts at the very beginning of setting up a new JSPsych experiment. It's how you actually set up the project. So in version 6.3, what you might do is you would go to GitHub, you would download the latest zip file, the latest release of JSPsych. So you would just click on the file and get a zip file. And then you take those files on your computer and you add them to your HTML document and you'd be off to the races. In version 7, there's now several different ways you can set it up, but one of them is very familiar. So you can still go to GitHub like this. You can still find a zip file that you can click on to download, and it will have all of the files that you need to run the experiment in it. And it'll still look pretty familiar if you're used to JSPsych 6. So at the top of your HTML document, you might have some script tags for loading in the JSPsych file, for loading in a plugin, and a link tag for loading in the CSS. Note that the naming convention for the plugins has changed a little bit, but that's really it. The second option that you now have for version 7 is to use the files that are directly hosted on a content distribution network, so a CDN. So these are stable version-specific files. So note that like the reference here is to version 7.1.2. These versions don't change once they're published. So it's safe to use these links for reproducible experiments. And it's also just really convenient for fast setup. So you don't need to download anything anymore. You can just open up a HTML document. You can type in the links to the files, and you can start right away. This is now when I teach new people how to use JSPsych, like students that I'm working with. This is where I start, where I just show them how to access the files directly from the CDN. And then the third option, which is sort of the whole impetus for creating version 7, is that you can now use proper JavaScript modules if you're in a development environment where that makes sense to do. So you can use npm to install JSPsych and install any of the plugins or extensions. You can import them into your project like you would with any other JavaScript module. You do need to know a little bit more about modern JavaScript development for this option. It's definitely less, there's a steeper learning curve to this than there is for, just opening up a document and using the CDN. But if you're familiar with this sort of world of development, or if you want to do things that are, more, you're trying to integrate into a larger sort of application, then this might be the right choice to set things up. Okay, so why did we do all this? Well, one reason was to have more flexibility. Basically, we wanted to be able to have JavaScript modules, and in order to do that, we needed to support that third option. And then at the same time, we wanted to make it still easy to use for people who are already familiar with version 6. So you've got the CDN option, which is great for first-time users, and even I use it all the time when I'm not planning to sort of modify the code more. There's more ways you can get started with JSPsych now, and it supports a wider range of different development environments that you might find yourself in. Another nice change that came with this piece of it is that every piece of JSPsych. So the core library, all of the plugins that we have, all of the extensions that we have, all of those things are now their own package, their own little project. So we can now quickly upgrade and patch individual parts. If somebody discovers a bug in one of our plugins, we don't have to wait to make the next release of JSPsych. We can just patch that immediately and upload it right away, which is going to help, I think, sort of make the development cycle a little bit more rapid for us. And finally, I think package managers are just useful. So one of the cool things that I'm hoping will happen with this is that, with NPM as a way to distribute JSPsych, now it's easier for people who are not part of the JSPsych core group to sorry, there's a dog barking outside my office. It's now easier for people to contribute by just publishing their own packages to NPM. So you could, if you have your own plugin, like the audio recording stuff that we were just hearing about, that could just be published directly to NPM, and then people could use it in the same way that they use any of the built-in plugins or extensions that are part of JSPsych. So I'm hoping that this leads to something that feels a little bit more decentralized. Okay, so once you've got your project set up, there's a couple other changes. So change number 2 is kind of a small thing. When you're writing a trial in JSPsych, you would declare which plugin you want to use with the type parameter. And in version 6.3, that would have involved typing in a string. So if you want to use the HTML keyboard response plugin, this would be the string that you would put in. In version 7, you'll use the class name of the plugin instead. I think the naming convention here is pretty easy to follow. It becomes very clear when you're looking at the documentation. And it's a relatively minor change. I'm not going to explain why we did this quite yet because it's related to the next change, which is a little bit bigger. So change number 3 is that there is no more jsPsych.init. So in a version 6.3 experiment, what you would do is, create your timeline, and then you would launch JSPsych by calling JSPsych init. And we had to get rid of this. So now it looks like this. So we've split the functionality into 2 different pieces. At the very top of your script, or early on in your script, you'll want to create an instance of JSPsych. So we have a method now called init.jspsych. And that method returns a new copy of the JSPsych class. And in that init.jspsych method, you'll pass in all the parameters that you need to control your experiment. So here, showing a progress bar or choosing which kind of audio you want to use. But you're not going to pass in the timeline. So it looks almost the same as jspsych.init, but no timeline. And then you'll create your timeline. And then when you're ready to run the experiment, you'll call jspsych.run and pass in the timeline. Okay, so why did we have to make these changes? Well, these were both necessary because of underlying changes to the code that made JSPsych modular. So what it means to be modular is basically that the package is self-contained, that there's no variables that are global that get created by JSPsych or any other software that is modular. And we were using a global variable as kind of the main thing in JSPsych. So when you loaded the JSPsych script, it created this global variable called JSPsych, and all of the plugins relied on having that global variable, and all of the extensions and the whole ecosystem just depended on having this one global variable that everything sort of communicated through. And we had to get rid of it to make it JSPsych a module. So what we did instead is the init.jspsych allows you to create that JSPsych object. So you do that at the beginning of the experiment. And then you can use all the randomization features and other things that you might need to while you're building your timeline because you've created this copy of JSPsych. And then when you're ready to actually run the experiment, you just tell it to run. Side note is that there's an interesting bonus of making this change, which is that it's now possible to run multiple JSPsych experiments on one page because every experiment is self-contained. This is probably a pretty rare use case, but it is something that comes up every now and then. So, for example, someone is working on an interactive cognitive psychology textbook where they have experiments embedded in the web page for the textbook. And rather than now, being only able to have sort of one experiment per section of the book, now there could be multiple experiments on the same page. Okay, the last big thing is actually something that most people won't have to deal with. So if you have a custom plugin, or if you want to customize an existing plugin, then this change is relevant. But if you're just using the stuff that is built into JSPsych that we provide, then you don't need to worry about this. So in version 6.3, this is what the plugin template looked like. It's basically an object that gets attached to that global JSPsych variable. And it has some info as an object. It also has this trial method that runs whenever a trial is needed of that particular type. In version 7, the plugin is now a class. And the info object is a static property of the class. The trial method is basically the same, but there's also this constructor. So this thing that gets called whenever a new instance of this class is created. And that constructor gets a reference to JSPsych. And this is how we get around the global variable problem. So rather than having a global JSPsych, every plugin gets its own copy of JSPsych, but they all sort of share the same copy because we pass it to the plugins when they're created. Okay, so we made this change in part because of the modularization thing was sort of necessary, but also classes just are going to provide a better long-term developer experience. So I think it's easier for people to come into the code base who are interested in contributing in a more sustained way, and they can see more quickly what's going on because classes are just this familiar way of working. We made a lot of changes like this that are aimed at the developer experience in this core code base. So, for example, we adopted TypeScript, which helps us make sure that there are not errors in the code base based on mismatched types, like expecting an integer but getting a string or something like that. And frankly, like most users will never see those changes. But if you are interested in contributing to JSPsych, I would love to chat with you and tell you all about these better developer experience things that we've created and try to convince you to contribute to the project in a sustained way. That would be amazing. Okay, so we added, if any of this is sort of going by and you want to, going by too quickly, you want to review it, and you're working on migrating a project, we do have a migration guide as part of our documentation. It describes everything that I just covered, plus I skipped over a few very small details that are also covered in the migration guide. So that's version 7. And really, like a lot of it does look a little bit different, but it's really just the 3 big changes, right? It's how you set up the project, it's how you declare the type of a trial, and it's how you initialize and run your timeline. And then if you're doing plugin development, some stuff changes as well. Okay, so let me talk about version 7.1, which is probably actually the more exciting bit for most people here. So the first new thing that I want to share, which is actually technically part of version 7, is we added a community contributions repository. So we were starting to get a lot of people submitting their custom plugins to the JSPsych library, and frankly, it was too much for us to take on because whenever we add something to the library, we sort of commit to maintaining that and upgrading it as new versions of JSPsych come out. And we couldn't do that. There's just not enough of us and too many contributions coming in, which is kind of a cool problem to have. So we created a new repository on GitHub called JSPsych Contrib. And basically, if anybody has a plugin that they find useful for their own experiments and they think other people might benefit from as well, whether because people might use it directly or just because it's useful code to see an example of, you can add it to this repository. It still goes through a review process, but it's very minimal. It's just basically we make sure that it works, and we ask you to document it a little bit, and then we can add it. And we already have several contributions that are part of this repository. It launched a few months ago, and there's a handful of things already in there. And there's also a new extension coming that somebody's working on to track like accelerometer movement of smartphones during experiments and things like that. So I think this is going to speed up the development cycle and make it easier to find all the really cool things that people are building with jsPsych. We did add some new plugins in version 7.1. So this one is similar to what I think Matt was talking about, but it's sort of our official version for now. So we added a plugin to record audio responses to HTML stimuli. So with this plugin, which you can see sort of a demo of on the right in sort of the classic audio stroop kind of thing, you can control the duration of a recording. You can let the participant control the duration if you want. You can let the participant hear what they recorded and choose whether to record again. You could optionally store the recording that gets generated in a particular way that lets you reuse it as a stimulus later in the experiment. We also, as part of building this plugin, we added another plugin that just manages the microphone settings. So if you've ever tried to run an audio recording experiment online, one of the things you have to deal with is that you can't just turn on somebody's microphone. You have to ask permission to use it. So we added a plugin that manages that permission so that you can ask for it one time at the start of the experiment. You can let the participant choose which microphone they're going to use. And then for the duration of the experiment, you can have access to that microphone. And you can see that in the animation that's playing. The second new plugin that we added is what we call browser check. So this plugin can measure a variety of features of the participant's browser and can also optionally exclude participants based on certain criteria that you set. So it can measure the window size, whether there's support for web audio, what browser type and version they're using, their operating system, whether they're on a mobile device, whether their thing supports full screen. It estimates the frame rate of the computer. So, most devices run at 60 hertz, but that is now changing. There's a lot more higher frame rate devices coming out, so you can estimate that in case it's relevant. It also tells you whether there is a webcam or a microphone, although it doesn't tell you whether the participant will give you permission to use it. You'll have to use a different plugin for that. And then, once you've measured all these things, you can optionally say, I only want people who are using Chrome and Firefox to complete my experiment, and it'll branch people, but in different ways based on what it measures. The third new plugin is a new survey plugin. So if you're familiar with jsPsych, we had some plugins to do some questionnaire stuff before, but basically it was limited in that you could only have like one type of question per page. So you could ask like a text box question, or you could ask a multiple choice question, but you couldn't really mix them together. And that's changed with the survey plugin. So we found this really great library called Survey.js. It's another open source project. And we basically just built a jsPsych plugin that wraps around that library. In fact, that library is so comprehensive that we're still working on wrapping more and more of it into jsPsych. But it lets you do things like mix and match questions on the same page. You can navigate forward and backward through survey pages. You can score responses, whether they're correct or not. You can make things required or optional. It's really a big upgrade to the kinds of surveys and questionnaires that you can do with jsPsych now. And then the last new plugin is a Sketchpad plugin. So this lets participants draw in response to a prompt, so you can show some sort of HTML above a canvas, and then participants can click and draw on it. You can it's not shown in the animation here, but you can have a color palette that can be used. You can even put a background image on the canvas, so you could use it for a really simple image annotation task where you say, circle any dogs with the orange color and circle any cats with the blue color, and it would let you do some image segmentation stuff. And then you can even take these images that are generated and you can use them as stimuli later on in the experiment. So you could have somebody generate something and then later show it to them and say, what was this thing that you drew? And then the last sort of big piece of it is this extension. So extensions were actually a feature that we added in 6.3, but maybe unfamiliar to many people. So extensions are they're a way to layer some sort of data collection on top of existing plugins. So in version 6.3, the extension that we added was for eye tracking. So we added the WebGazer library as an extension of jsPsych, which let you turn on eye tracking at any point in the experiment. And this extension that we released in version 7.1 does the same thing, but for mouse tracking. So you can record the position of the mouse and position and time of the mouse throughout the entire experiment if you'd like to. And you can even record the coordinates of objects on the screen so that it's easier to line up mouse trajectories with the things that you care about on the screen for easier analysis later on. Okay, and the very last thing that I want to show you is probably my favorite thing, which is simulation mode. So this is how you would set up a typical 7.0 experiment, right? So we initialize jsPsych, we create a timeline, and then we run the timeline. Simulation mode lets you simulate your entire experiment. So it lets you, not interact with it, but still generate data from it by just changing the .run to .simulate. You don't have to do anything else. Just making that change will basically make a robot do your experiment for you. So here's an example of what this looks like. So this is a lexical decision task that is actually going on. And then I'm going to go into the code here and scroll down to the bottom of that code, change the .run to .simulate, and then launch the experiment again. Go back to it and just refresh the page. And immediately I get data for the entire experiment. And the cool thing is that the data is plausible. Now, it's not realistic. It's not, nobody's going to look at this data and say, oh, a human did that. But it's also not, implausible. So it's not, people won't look at it and say, well, there's no way a human did this. It picks response times that are reasonable, that follow response time distributions that we know people follow. Probably the biggest weakness in an experiment like this is that its accuracy will probably end up being about 50-50 because it just chooses responses at random. But you can tune all of that. So you can set it up to say, hey, for this kind of trial, I want the response to be correct 90% of the time. And for this kind of trial, I want the response to be correct 50% of the time. And I'm not showing it here, but there's also another simulation mode other than just running the experiment instantly and getting the data. You can also simulate it visually. So you can sort of watch the experiment run without interacting with it. And it's kind of pointless for me to show you that over a Zoom call because you won't be able to tell the difference between me interacting with it and it just running. But you can just make the experiment run, and you'll be able to watch it go. And you can use this for a variety of interesting things. So, yeah, why am I excited about this? Well, there are at least 4 use cases that we've thought of so far that I think are all things that are kind of hard to do with any other experiment development platform right now. So the first is that you might automatically test your code. So say you have an experiment where somebody needs to get 80% of the trials correct before it proceeds to the next part of the experiment. And the typical way that we might verify that that's working is like through just painstakingly taking our experiment over and over again until we are pretty confident that it's doing what we want. But now you could actually just simulate it. You could say, hey, simulate this experiment and get 85% of them correct, and I'm going to make sure by looking at the data that it went to the correct part of the experiment at the correct time. And in fact, with tools that people use in software development for testing code, you could actually set up a whole test suite to verify the behavior of your experiment without having to interact with it at all. So you could write a bunch of rules that say this is how my experiment should behave, and verify that that's what actually happens. The second use case is that you can probably speed up development. So in that same situation where you're trying to test something that happens only certain parts of the time, if you can actually turn on simulation for parts of the experiment. So you could turn it on for just the trials that are leading up to the thing that you care about, And that way you get data for all of those trials. And then you can use that data in the thing that you're working on actively. Like maybe you're working on some sort of feedback screen that's showing people how accurate they were. And in order to test that, you need to actually run through the previous part of the experiment. Well, now you can simulate that instead. You can also use this to quickly generate data sets for developing analysis tools or analysis pipelines. So if you want to make sure that your R script or whatever can import the data from JSPsych and analyze it in an appropriate way, you don't have to run your experiment anymore. You can just simulate it, and then you can pull that data into R or whatever package you're using, and you can start building analysis code based on the simulated data. And the last thing, which I wish I had a live demo for to show you, but I don't right now, is that you can actually visualize participant behavior. So by tuning the simulation parameters to match what somebody did in the experiment, you can actually sort of play back what they did. So you run your experiment, you record all of their response times and all of their, whatever keys they're pressing and whatever buttons they clicked on. And then you go back and you run the experiment in simulation mode, and you just tell the simulation to use all of the same responses that the participant made. And then you can actually sort of watch a movie of your participant doing the experiment because the simulation will behave like the participant did. And I think this would be, really interesting as a way to do some, potentially like checking for mistakes that people are making or behaviors that are odd. Might be faster to just watch people do the experiment in development than to look through data files and try to find stuff that way. And also kind of cool for presentations like this. You could say, here's what it actually looks like when people do the experiment. Okay, so I'll end there. Just here's the website. Huge thanks to the JSPsych core team, which is Becky and Bjorn and myself. Becky and Bjorn were just huge contributors to the 7.0 and 7.1 stuff, and it really wouldn't have happened without them. There's been 60 plus other contributors to JSPsych over the years, so thanks to all of them as well. And I hope there's going to be a lot more. I hope it really does become this community managed project. And if you want to get in touch with me, there's my email, or you can find me on Twitter. And thanks.